Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. It is 2 o'clock, so this hearing session into the Newham local plan is now open. I'm in Fieldhouse, the inspector appointed by the Secretary of State to examine the plan. Can you hear me at the back? Yes, you can. So we had microphones this morning, and we did. We passed them around, and now we've taken them away. So, two things. Obviously, it's important for people in the room to be able to hear, so please speak up for that reason, but also this session is being broadcast live on YouTube, and it's probably a little bit difficult for people to hear. The microphone is in the middle of the room, so you don't have to talk in any particular direction other than the way you would naturally, but do try and please speak up. I will just go through some opening statements, which I know most of you tried to sit through this morning. I won't do quite the same, but I will have to go through because there are some different people here. I'll just introduce Sophie Edwards, who's been a planning inspector for a number of years, working on planning appeals and the casework, but not yet on local plans. As part of her training for conducting local plan examinations next year, she's spending a couple of days with us here in Newham. But just to be clear, I'm the inspector solely responsible for this examination, and Sophie is simply here to observe, and she won't be involved in the decisions and recommendations that I make about the plan. Housekeeping, a reminder please to make sure laptops, etc. are switched to silent. We've got water in the room. If you need replenishment, I'm sure we can get some. Toilets are on the ground floor, back out into the lobby, around to the right and to the left under the stairs. There's no fire alarm test planned for this afternoon, so if it does go off, I think we'll recognise it. We'll need to vacate the building, back out through the door, out into the lobby, back round to the left, out through the front door, and around to the assembly point opposite the DLR station around the end of the building. If anyone needs assistance with the evacuation or work with the council officers if they haven't made that quickly steps to get away. So that's the housekeeping. Charlotte's around this afternoon with the program officer, so if you can get an assistance, I'll work with her. This afternoon we're doing two, the amount of development required in the plan period, and you'll see on there, which we will go through in turn. We'll probably have a 15, depending on where we are on the agenda, for 15 minutes, and then resume. We will aim to finish by 5 o'clock at the latest. I think everyone here basically know the format of this hearing session, so I won't go through the details. All I will say is that I will start each agenda item with some questions to the council, and I'll go through those. And we'll then invite opportunities for the people to speak. If you want to speak, just put your nameplate up on end. I'll bring you in at a time. A couple of other things I'll mention. Main modifications. The council did submit a schedule of proposed modifications with the documents along with the plan in July. However, they are not part of the plan that I'm examining. And therefore, I've not taken those into account in my questions and in my assessment of the submitted plan. But what I give the council in my notes is that if in responding to my questions, my preliminary questions or my issues and questions, they felt some modifications necessary to address the issue that I raised, they could draw on those proposed modifications if relevant. There is a schedule of main modifications that is before me that I am taking account of, and that is ED6. That was published on the 21st of November, and that does contain some modifications to parts of the plan that we are discussing this afternoon and elsewhere this week and next, which they may be relevant to refer to this afternoon. I'll just quickly mention the other documents that have been published since participants put their written statements in. So these are documents that are subsequent to those statements, and you want to refer to them. You may have seen them subsequently, but I just thought I'd go through them this morning. The first one is ED5, Statement of Common Ground with Thames Water, which will be relevant to matter for tomorrow. There's the Statement of Common Ground, ED7, GLA, that is relevant to this afternoon, and it will be relevant to a number of the matters we talk about. EDS, which is housing and supply information, which is sort of relevant to this afternoon, will be more relevant before we go through the allocations, which provides a trajectory for the development of each of the allocation plan. Some ED9, which was housing and supply inflation, which won't come on to that level of detail in terms of the housing and supply until the session in January, I don't think. Then there's a ED10, ED11, ED12 were all about viability, which we talked about this morning, and we'll come back to and refer to as necessary, including in relation to allocations. So I think, unless there's any procedural queries or anything that raises a point, go around the table, ask people to introduce themselves. I could start with the council.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Danny Edmond, and I'm the interim planning manager.
Richard Pascal, partner of planning at Rapley's on behalf of Planning Department.
Sarah Graham, senior planner, and Claire Lawrence, principal planner in the Department.
I've been sent from Bramble, representing
Selena Kahuna, council EIM, and we have various other people, but I think Mr. Tennant is going to be the only person probably myself.
Okay.
John Turner, Director of Planning.
Yeah, Jolene, Associate Rockton Planning, representing Planning.
John Bishop, Director of Planning at Rockton Planning, City Planning.
Planning Director for Coil representing claims.
James Stevens, Homeland Federation.
Karen Montgomery, Greater London Authority and Strategic.
Okay, well, welcome to everyone. Could you hear everyone at the back? Could you hear everyone? And it's difficult, but people just try and speak as clearly and loud enough. Oh, we're about to start matter one again, so I better skip forward. Right, so we're looking first at the time period, and obviously this is relevant to the housing and to the requirement for industrial and office floor space. As you all know, national policy expects strategic policies to look ahead a minimum of 15 years period from adoption. But there is no reference actually in national policy to a plan period. And plans typically have on their front cover, doesn't, a period to which it relates. But in essence, this plan, insofar as policies are time-bound or time-specific, relates to a period of 2023 to 2038. And that is the period at which the housing requirement is set in the plan, as I think the requirements for industrial and office floor space may be related to that period of time. But we have, the council has responded to various questions on it, but to propose modifications in relation to that. So I'm just going to talk about that first before we look at the housing requirements and the industrial and floor space requirements. The first thing is about the end date. So 2038 clearly wasn't consistent with national policy about 15 years out from adoption. I know this can be interpreted in different ways, but I think it's become very well established what the NPPF means by following adoption. And that plans tend to deal in financial years in terms of monitoring, so 1st of April up to 31st of March. If this plan is adopted between 1st of April 2026 and 31st of March 2027, the strategic plan is to look ahead at least 15 years from the look ahead to, 31st of March 2042. The council's nodding, that's what you confirm that you agree with that. So that would be a modification to the plan. It would have implications for a number of policies. Policy H1, the housing requirement, we clearly talk about that. It would have an implication for policy J1, and Rapley's done some work to address that, which we'll come on to. So that's understood. So looking ahead 15 years from adoption, those two policies would, based on what proposed. Are there any other policies in the plan that actually this makes any difference to, in terms of being time bound and?
No other policies in the
No, so it's those two policies. Yeah. Okay. That's my understanding. If anyone wants to point anything out, it's different. Fine. Okay. So that's clear enough. So and we'll consider both of those in turn, but just to take an initial look at this. Your proposed modification to policy H1 moves the housing requirements to reflect what NPPF asks housing supply to do, which is a 5-year supply following adoption, and then 10 and 15 years subsequently. So everything would look ahead from the year after adoption. So everything would look ahead from 2017 to 2042. Very neat, very up-to-date plan. So up-to-date, wouldn't even come into effect when it's adopted possibly, which does raise a question, which we'll come back to, I think, under the housing requirement. Would actually be a bit of a policy gap in the for 1st of April 2027. And to talk about that for now, first ask the question at this stage. The housing requirements, the industrial office floor space requirement, that would look ahead to 2042. What is the proposal? Where would it start from? Would it matter? In the submitted plan, it's 2023, isn't it? You've rolled it forward.
So the numbers we've got in the new paper that was attached to your Matter 2 statement, it takes as a starting point 2021. So it's the supply that's been added, subtracted since that base date. So our starting dates remain the same. Rolled on the end date. But
if it starts at 2021 and it's based, is there some supply that has now been measured and completed, and then so you could roll forward a start date to what based on the completion stage?
As far as I'm aware, the supply in that paper in the tables takes into account the space that's been committed, lost, gained since 21, and the last monitoring, which I think is up to last year. There's always a slight.
1st of March 2024.
There's always a slight delay in it. I can double check whether it's March 24, but it's as up to date as the borough has.
So your figures set a requirement for 1st of April 2024?
Yeah.
2047?
Yes, essentially.
Okay.
So they're based in 21, but everything that's happened between 21 and 24 has been taken into account and netted off.
So submitted plan is 2023. So the next question, I suppose, is that's, as I said at the beginning, there's no requirement to set a plan period as such. You could set a different requirement period for your industrial and office floor space, I guess, from your housing requirement. There's nothing necessarily inconsistent with that, I don't think. But is that where the council's at? You've got one policy expressed for that period, another street policy for that period, and none of the other policy that matters. And on the front cover, it doesn't say anything about it. We could do it.
Yes, we could do
2042 or something.
2042 amended.
Okay. Right, so I'll finish that there from my point of view, and we'll come up to the housing requirement and my various questions. Unless there's anything else you want to say on that I've just been through, I'll open it up to see if anyone else wants to say anything. No? Okay. Anyone else? No? Okay, well, we'll deal with each in turn. But in principle, there's no issue with what we'll just describe. Anyway, so. Right, fine. So, the housing requirement in this plan is it's not the usual exercise we go through where we have a needs assessment and then a requirement. This is a London-specific, capacity-based figure. And for that reason, because I am going to be examining the capacity figures for the allocations and the other components of supply, I'm not going to talk about the numbers today because it's too early to do so, and we can spend a lot of time doing that and come to the conclusion, then it would all change when we've been through everything else. So my questions are not about the numbers, it's about the way the policy is expressed. You've talked about the period to which it relates, so that's fine. So we will go through the different questions I have in terms of the way the policy is set up. But just on the numbers, just to be absolutely clear, I'm sure this is the case, we've got a set of different figures. We've got the pro formas from the EPA for each allocation, and we've got some requirement figures in the statement of around the GLA. The latest versions of those are the same data. They are the sum total of the same things. Yeah. And so I'm not going to worry about those particular numbers, but it's all you've got to position them.
The performance and the statement from the GLA and our responses to matters from that represent the most up-to-date data that we have.
And they are the figures for the allocations of the ED8. The pro formas in each site.
Yes.
Yeah. That's fine. So that's where we are. So I'll go through my questions 2.28 to E. I'm going to start first with the question B, because that's about the principle of a capacity-based, needs-based requirement. So obviously national policy expects, and it doesn't make a distinction for London or anywhere else, it expects a local authority to look at housing need and accept the requirement on taking account of that. The London plan sets a framework, and that it takes a capacity-based approach. So that's the simple answer. There's no requirement, you don't think, in national policy, or if there is, it's sort of covered by a London plan, particular circumstances. Simple as that, yeah. Yeah, okay, that's fine. Yeah, I mean, do you want to elaborate on that at all? And is anything changing looking ahead? I know.
Well, obviously,
yeah.
to the next London plan, but fundamentally, regardless of the need figure underlying the London plan, which would be 8,000 grand, the approach to distributing that need across London from available land capacity is absolutely the same, because fundamentally London is a single housing market for the purposes of planning. So no changes to how we distribute and direct boroughs to move the housing targets that we set in the plan.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay, so it's a simple, which obviously I'm sure not planning, don't need to know what it is, but the principle, there's nothing consistent.
Yes.
And in terms of the HPF, I mean, I've read a statement to understand what you're saying in retrospect, you know, and obviously I was involved in the process. But you also point out interestingly that the new standard method for Newham will give a figure, 2249.
Yeah.
And that is lower than, significantly lower than the figures that are coming out through this plan. As a context, it's not the same as any particular significance to that, other than it shows that Newham is playing a role in London to meet wider needs down locally.
I only provide it as an indicator.
Yeah.
I fully understand the function plan. The Mayor of London assesses the need in aggregate and decides how that's apportioned. My argument was that, do you want me to go into this now?
Briefly. Yeah.
The main thrust is what happens to the current London plan as required
Yes.
when it ends in 2028-29.
Yeah.
And once you've deducted that from the overall requirement,
yeah.
that might be 47, it doesn't really need much for the subsequent years of the new local plan.
Okay. No, thank you. Sorry, and there's different ways of looking at that.
And it's considerably lower. Those capacity-based assessments is much lower than other indicators that suggest it might have to be provided. Have to be provided by you in the future.
Okay. So capacity-based approach. Ballymore, do you want to, I mean, I know you pointed out and quite understand that it isn't consistent with national policy in the sense that national policy expects a needs-based approach. Do you want to, I mean, do you want to say?
I think just to add to the context, we see where London is going. Newham has historically everything else in London. Its housing targets are above where the state method currently rejects, but there are some boroughs who are patently unable to do that level. But just as context, so depending which way you want to measure this, Newham has delivered between the metrics of delivery between 5 and 7% of London's housing needs going forward. If you put that against 88,000 homes, which we believe we new target, that would require a delivery per annum somewhere close to 5,000 homes per annum. So if you look at the need in the single housing market for London, I would suggest the figures at the center at the moment are not reflective of where it's very difficult in a transitional period, but where London housing target is going to 28,000. And if Newham is to continue a similar trajectory of vision that they have done historically, current numbers here below probably would be expected of them to do. And that is, it's a difficult one because I expect we've got different targets coming forward. But if you look at it in context of the new step method, I think we're below where that needs to be.
But, well, we'll come back to this and we'll explore it. But I mean, the council's position is we've optimised capacity on every bit of land that we've identified. So basically, we're squeezing every bit of, development out of the borough that we can, based on, our policy requirements, our strategic priorities. And I guess this will come back in terms of things like tall buildings and whatever capacity on site. I know that with GLA, going back to your Regulation 19 representation, is concerned that actually is, has maximised or optimised capacity, hence the discussions that we've had and the position we've now reached. So, yeah.
And I think it's helpful to make both historically, but just one note of caution on looking at historically what Newham has delivered versus what we would expect Newham to deliver going forward. I think I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that our housing targets do go up and down as the London plan is updated, because that's an element of the capacity-based approach, fundamentally looking to optimize site capacity and the available supply of land across London. It does need to be acknowledged that in certain cases, sites do get built out, we do deliver housing, and that will ultimately impact where those boroughs sit in terms of levels of housing delivery in the greater London context.
Yes, and I'm straying into London planning too. I mean, this time, Greenbelt Review is on the agenda, isn't it?
Yes.
So the capacity for outer boroughs different. Potentially. Okay, well, okay. I think we've gone probably too far into London plan review than we need to, but understood it's, you can look at this different ways, but it's important for you to optimise capacity because that's what it's seeking to do. That's what's required. Isn't it? Okay. So anything else on that basic?
Thank you, sir. I think Mr. Tennant might like just to chip in with a couple of points on the basing issue. That way.
Thank you. Yes, I think it's just important to point out that the 47600 figure, which constitutes the London Plan Housing Target, obviously the council's respective supply over the whole plan period, which is somewhat in excess of 50,000 units, doesn't address the residual target that you identified. So just to kind of flag that as just put a mark on that point, the housing target, if we're straying into discussion about the housing target, does need to take into account that residual figure needs to look at the 20% buffer as well. So just to kind of, as I say, put down the mark that the supply figure that the council has come up with, so just something like 50,000 units, in no way, I think, achieves the sort of level of supply that we need to achieve in order to meet it.
Understood. Yeah. So I mean, you can look at it in lots of different ways about the adequacy of the 55 or 50, whatever the figure is, in terms of how it relates back to what they should have been achieving in the past, how it may look ahead to what they may need to achieve to meet London's needs in the future. But it all comes back to the same thing, really. The question being, does the plan optimise the opportunities and capacity that's available? And so that's what, for all the reasons that you referred to, that's what it should need to do. Yes.
Yes, indeed. I mean, I think obviously from our perspective, we feel that the generic approach to design has been applied across the board to these sites.
Okay. Yes.
And as a result of that, there is an unjustified cap on development. In fact, means that they're not meeting the requirements of the policy in each one of them. Densities, which is a huge mismatch.
Yeah. Well, come on from a number of different perspectives about whether the plan is optimising capacity on the land, including tomorrow through the spatial strategy, the tall buildings, when we go through all the allocations about what the evidence suggests capacities are those are. So this is just sort of setting the context, which I understand is the need to get as many new homes built in Newham as you can for the various different ways of looking at it quite needed, including the authority's own priority to provide more affordable homes. We can address some of the issues that you referred to in opening point. Yeah. So,
there was a range proposed for the housing project.
About range. Because I'm going to go through so I think that a range.
I think to say that sites can't be optimised. We're going to the range.
To optimise them, we'll go on to it, but it's probably you'd need to set higher.
Yes.
Because that's one. Okay. So anything else on my question 2.2b, which is the principle of a capacity-based? Yes.
Just the
yeah.
I know the preparation comments about your current London plan target beyond the London plan period. I think what we would say is that in Newham there is a very important protected point that we do contain the LDC area, which is optimised capacity with the Stratford neighbourhood. And it is likely, given the stage of progress that lots of those sites in the LDC area are, that additional 14,000-ish homes that is additional to our current Newham-based target without the LDC, that capacity is likely to increase over time. And then the other thing, just to raise quickly, is that our getting into the GLA's emerging SHAR process. So our assumptions that underpin the local plan are also those that have underpinned our input into the GLA's current work undertaken the London SHAR. So we build our positions on those two to reflect the emerging local plan and how that needs to.
Yeah.
Just to say that, I mean, principle we're supportive of the idea of the capacity-based approach beyond financial year 2029. But I think it's just important to remember that given that it is a capacity-based approach, the council should be meeting that target. It's not like the standard method-based housing need figure where the council can set a housing requirement figure that's less than the housing need on the basis of constraints. Because it is capacity-based and based on an understanding of sites, the council should be meeting that target, which is therefore it's of great concern that historically councils allowed a significant backlog to have built up in the last few years, which makes the issue of the backlog this examination critically important for moving forward. Very important that the backlog is properly reflected in the housing target that is set. And so there is a real sense that the council is getting to grips with this importance.
Oh, okay. Well, the backlog, the target's capacity-based, isn't it? The backlog is an indication of unmet need, I suppose. Yes. Yes. It comes back to the same fundamental point, I think, is does the plan optimise capacity in every way you can? look at, I understand. We're going to go through how the London plan is reflected in the plan, how it should be, etc. So let's move on. So the next question was my question A, which was the principle of if it's a housing requirement, does the plan, the wording of the range, needs to be modified to be more clear what the minimum housing requirement is? It's not expressed in those words, is it? And the council proposed a modification. Do you not?
Yes, we have.
To just clarify.
So we proposed an indicative wording, but as that's
Figure.
because it's in the final numbers, it reflects the numbers in the presenting plan, but we can't update that as necessary.
So that would be a bit clearer that there's a minimum requirement, which is the MPF phrase, so there's no ambiguity. Then there's a discussion about if there's a range, is it the minimum, which you say would be the bottom of the range, or the top of the range. So let's park that and deal with that when we talk about whether a range is effective and justified. I suppose that by doing what you're proposing, it's at least clear whether it's justified. It doesn't matter. So anything on that, the principle of range being absolutely clear with the wording about there is a minimum requirement, 18 whatever. So that's right. So question C then is the reference to a target range justified? Does it provide an effective and unambiguous approach? Maybe I forgot to remind people to switch their mobiles and laptops to sleep. So you say the range is justified. The bottom is the minimum requirement based on known capacity. Yeah. Whereas the top is to optimise capacity beyond that, taking account of various things, not all of which can be said to be certain enough to set a requirement.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair summation. So the range target only applies to 5 sites, site allocations within the plan. 8 sites. Apologies. There's 3 sites where we have external planning permissions for lower figures, but we've also designed and capacity tested those sites. So before that new permission comes forward with higher range capacity, we would seek to rely on the extant permissions. We have 1 site where an extant permission is exceeded by design testing, so the permission in that instance on Thames North West performs the high range figure, and the design link testing performs the low range figure. We then have 2 sites that are dependent on major infrastructural improvements to optimise housing delivery, but with the certainty of securing those bits of infrastructure are, almost certain. We've sought to include low range figures on those sites. There's 1 site with a 2 boundary options, so one with a slightly more compact boundary option and then one with a more master plan involving lands at the rear of the site. And then we have 1 final option where there are options about where leisure is to be directed. So if it's to be directed to better facilities for effective town centre, and in that case the range figure reflects a slightly different requirement on respective town centre.
We'll go through each and where there's a range we'll discuss, but the principle being we still think it's appropriate for the reasons, site-specific reasons, and the policy, the modification will be clear that the minimum requirements not to the range. So that's the meaningful figure really in terms of working out your 5-year housing land requirement, etc.
I think it's fair to say that in no way would having a low range figure on the site mean we wouldn't support optimised housing delivery on high range assumptions. So we're trying to make sure that the site allocations reflect once the planning is optimising the site, once we're recognising that it's necessary uncertainty at this stage, but there would be in the future to rely on higher figures.
Okay, comments on the principle of a range based on the rationale that has been mentioned. The modification would at least clarify what the minimum requirement would be, either bottom of the range, which but the principle of a range, nothing much to add.
I mean, obviously, you go first.
No, I haven't got one.
Sorry, I thought Well, so the only point really to make is that, which is one you said in introduction, which is uncertainty. And therefore, and also if the central position is optimization, then there is no need for a range, because you don't, and also in particular, you've heard the reason for the range comes down to individual sites, not the overall term. So you're always going to have to go to your individual sites in order to understand what is meant by that range. So, so we don't see that provides certainty.
Understood. Well, okay, so we're going to come back to it on allocation. We'll come back to the issue about the plan including a figure or not a figure for individual allocations, etc. So there's various ways of looking at it, but okay, so thank you. The next one is again a question of principle. Is the inclusion of stepped requirements consistent with national policy and guidance? Now, planning policy guidance is clear that a stepped housing requirement may be appropriate where there is to be a significant change in the level of housing requirement between emerging and previous policies. I don't think that's necessarily particularly maybe relevant, but I think that's dealing with where it's a need-based assessment and it's jumping up and it may need a bit of time to adjust. But and/or where strategic sites will have a phased delivery or likely to deliver later in the time period, which I think is the Newham position, is your trajectories for each site are reflected in the step trajectory for the plan as a whole. So you've worked out on your allocations and any other sites that you've got through your plan or whatever else. That's what the step trajectory will reflect. That's the best summary of where you think these sites will come forward.
Yeah, exactly. So it's based on what, when you looked at sites where developers indicate they might bring forward. And obviously, our issues with housing delivery in recent years, we're very consistent that we're not wanting to follow the housing delivery text and present a realistically justified step approach to meeting a very ambitious housing target. And yeah, this is the most appropriate way to do that. And yeah, we agree that it's the bulk of our site allocations are very large, very complex sites delivering various structural requirements. And it is realistic, I think, to assume that infrastructure delivery comes before the delivery of homes on some of those sites. So it does mean that in some cases you're going to have housing that can be long-term basis and you'll move on short-term. Again,
we'll come back to those, those sites and those infrastructure requirements and the extent to which the phased approach or whatever it is justified. And you refer to London Plan Policy H1 paragraph 4.1.10 as part of your justification for a step trajectory. Just summarise why that is. London Plan Policy H1, you refer to paragraph 4.1.10, so I assume that's reason justification.
Is so it states in relation to delivering the London Plan housing targets, that the housing targets may be achieved gradually as realistic were appropriate over a 10-year period. So I think similar to the point that Karen was making earlier, there are going to not necessarily going to be delivery of housing over the plan period. There are going to be these drops in terms of delivery. And I guess we tried to look at addressing that through the step trajectory that relies on assumptions and sites.
I'm looking at the paragraph now. So there's this explicit reference to steps. GLA then, next year.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's just helpful to, the paragraph obviously has come up recently in various different contexts. I think as well to focus on, obviously, that paragraph is referring to the housing targets within the 10-year London plan period. But fundamentally, it also needs to be read in context with paragraph 4.1.11 about post-2029 and what we should do in terms of the housing target, which I think is relevant to your question about we're a new London plan in place now. that target would overtake the local plan housing target. We're still, unfortunately, a couple of years away from that happening. So fundamentally, more and more boroughs are triggering paragraph 4.111. So the use of a step trajectory is becoming more common in that sense of where boroughs have the capacity. We obviously very much strongly encourage boroughs to roll forward the current plan target or to get exceeding it. In other cases where boroughs have done their work, and this is reflected in the statement of common ground, and the target post 2029 will look different than what's in the current plan. So that kind of principle, those two paragraphs together, I think is quite important.
But just to be clear then, so you're saying 4.1.11 also helps justify, because it's talking about a capacity-based approach,
Yeah.
that inevitably the capacity could be stepped.
Yeah, so fundamentally we've had extensive discussions with Newham about the statement of common ground. Pragmatically, the only, you could take a different requirement from 2029 at the end of the plan period and annualize it, but our fundamental point of difference which we resolve with incorporating the London plan target up to 2029. Which is proposed through those models.
Which we'll come on to shortly. Thank you. HBF.
Yes, our view on the step trajectory and whether it's acceptable or not is very much linked to that question about what we do about the residual number target, which is your figure, sir, which the council hasn't disagreed with, and I don't agree with, which is 17,248. Now, if this was 5 years ago and you represented this plan, then we probably wouldn't object to the step trajectory. And that's consistent with the London plan, paragraph 4.10, because the overall requirement set by 4.1 isn't an annual average, it's a 10-year target. Now, we'll part the question about what we do about that residual number housing need and where that sits. And as I said in my statement, I think it's probably unrealistic to expect them to deliver it all in the next 2 years. That's not going to happen. So we can try and be reasonable about this. But I think a step trajectory is only legitimate. Were you, say, producing this plan 5 or 6 years ago when you were really endeavouring to meet the London plan target, I don't think it's justified at this juncture, especially when once you've deducted the residual London plan target and you're looking at what's left to deliver based upon capacity, that capacity is really quite low. Based on my calculations, I worked it out as about 425 dwellings a year. I accept what the council says, that what might have happened in the past in terms of capacity isn't necessarily going to be replicated in the future by the next London plan, but nonetheless it seems to be quite significantly below where you might expect Europe to be delivering.
But the logic of what you're saying is that the targets in this plan would be a mixture of meeting need, i.e. insofar as this backlog of 17,000 or the unmet need against the target. And that was capacity based anyway, but I mean, you're treating it as, well, that's unmet need. It's 17,000 houses that haven't been built since 2019, it shouldn't be. Therefore, they need to be built as soon as possible. Yes? Whereas the other way of looking at it is, well, if this is the capacity based approach, surely the capacity-based approach ought to reflect the capacity, the realistic capacity that there is going over the time period.
Yes, and the GLA has said that where it's advised boroughs to roll forward the average annual figure, step trajectory. We're not in that situation here because they're not going for the annual average.
Taking a purely capacity-based.
But I take your point about if it's a purely capacity-based figure. Yeah. And this is the problem that we have with the London plan. Paragraph 4.1.11. We didn't foresee it at the time, but it's caused.
I don't know who examined it.
Can I just add
Yes.
something to that, just to be clear? So we have had extensive discussions with you, and if you extract the 5-year housing land supply, 20% buffer, and all of that, I'd take you back to the bit in the statement from the ground about in practice on the ground. When will the council project that they'll deliver that 10-year target cumulatively? And I can't remember the year off the top of my head.
2033, 34.
Yeah, so I think when you're looking at that capacity-based target, we've obviously looked very carefully at what is the 10-year target. If you discount for the 20% buffer, on the ground, how many homes is Newham delivered for London? How many years past 2029 are they? It is a handful of years. So I think that's important to bear in mind when we've been looking at that housing capacity, that obviously there is the MPPF requirement for the buffer. But homes on the ground, that delivery rate, when that's projected to be achieved, it is relatively quickly after the end of the current London planning housing target.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Joanna, AEIM, which do you prefer to be called?
AEIM is absolutely fine. Yeah, no, just to sort of contribute that, I mean, my reading of paragraph 1.10 is very much that for the step trajectory to kick in and towards open celebration. Say that if the council proposal would accept moving forward that target, then again, it seems to me that the argument that step trajectory is appropriate. I think for me, the kind of key term is where appropriate. And I think in understanding whether or not it's appropriate, it's useful just to consider national policy, national guidance, as I say, about a step trajectory. And what national policy does say, in planning practice guidance, land supply reference ID 68021, is that it should not be used where it can be shown that it's a means of unnecessary delay on meeting identified need. And I think, as I say, to go back to what about the cap on densities of the council's approach to design, it will be unintentional, and I do accept that perhaps there's an intention constraints on site densities. I mean, that's the result. And as a result, it is placing that constraint. And as a result, the step trajectory isn't justified because it's allowing the council to impose that constraint on site density, which results in not in effect meeting housing needs.
Okay, well, we'll come back to the policies about what they do, whether they do set caps. I mean, a step trajectory would set a minimum requirement, steps. It wouldn't set a cap. That policy, maximum building heights or indicative capacities for sites, you could say they may set caps or limits or constraints on capacity, but the minimum step requirement wouldn't set a cap, would it?
I'm not suggesting step trajectory itself is imposing a cap.
Okay.
What I'm suggesting is that the council, in not allowing sites to realise their full potential in terms of doing.
We're going to deal with that over time, aren't we? The policies about that. Yeah.
Yes, but all I'm saying is that only the step trajectory does represent a means of unnecessarily not meeting housing need in a timely way. Is allowing the council to achieve that outcome.
Okay. Thank you. Council, you have your name plate up.
Yeah, just a couple of quick clarification points to go back on the home builders federation point. Just to clarify, this is about the specific numbers, but just to that if you look at delivery from 2019, including the delivery against the London Plan target from that period, after we meet the London Plan housing target for 2033, 34, you get the rest of the plan period you to be on the real trajectory of about 27,800 homes. And then we would disagree with the point that the trajectory is going to create unnecessary delay in housing delivery. It's aligned with development expectations of when they intend to deliver sites across the plan period. So we would argue against that point. And we think that it is aligned with the PPG guidance around sites that are, the vast majority of our delivery across the plan period sites that are, very complex, very large, and likely to need to deliver significant infrastructure and approaches entirely.
Okay, so it's not unnecessarily going to need to be met as soon as possible because one, it's not setting a cap on the amount of development any particular year, and two, it reflects the realistic trajectory of delivery. Okay. Understood. Right. Anything else on steps requirements before we want to? There needs to be one. Yeah.
Just a couple of things. I think obviously we look at one issue, but taking the plan as a whole, there were quite a lot of debate this morning about affordability. We had a lot of debate about affordable housing. Is there sufficient? I mean, London is to be 88,000 target. Is there enough in this plan to help us even begin to get there? And there's an argument to say, whilst we understand all the logic of the trajectory, but is it ambitious enough with the rest of what's in the plan to achieve? It's very challenging, but important targets for this. I noticed the comments about the council's been under presumption based on the housing delivery test data 2023. The council is not hitting targets for those 3 years. I suspect no one in London will reach their targets in the next couple of years. So against that line, is the housing targets we're employing sufficiently optimistically ambitious to be able to achieve that with everything else that sits on that? I don't think we can take the result. We want to avoid the presumption in the future that when we set the targets lower can't be an answer to this, because there is an inference to that in the council's response. I mean, I just don't think the ambition is quite there. I understand the trajectory, I understand that it's a policy discussion, but you as a secondary outset has actually in the past quite good at delivering homes to London. It is quite a high percentage of that reservoir new homes at the moment. This, I don't think, using the trajectory approach, certainly the numbers that sit in the trajectory, is going to even be what's gone before. So there's a risk that this sort of perpetuates a drop-off, particularly in the short term, in housing delivery across Europe and the more components of housing delivery in London. I know that national policies are quite caught up here, but we might criticise government policy for not being ambitious enough. But if we are to tackle this, it's what it needs. Can we see that this is going to deliver that sort of target, which is going to enable the rest of the policies in the plan to start to really meet housing needs?
Yes.
Sorry, so
It's okay.
just to complete the point, if it's not to act as a cap, then plan officers stay safe.
Yes, I agree.
If it really isn't going to act that way, then that's good news, but let's make it clear.
Well, sorry.
That's it.
Yeah, I think the proposed motivation does do that by the way it's expressed as a minimum requirement, and then it sets out the figures for the minimum requirement for each of the period, each of the phases of steps. So I think it would do that. It still comes back to the point, well, are there other things they're saying they can? So the next question was just a kind of housekeeping one, really. If there is to be a step trajectory, does it need to be modified to include it in the policy rather than in the reason justification? It's PPGID 6821. Refer to strategic policymakers will need to identify the step requirement in strategic housing policies. I think it's pretty clear that you have one in the policy. So it's, again, and the policy is clear about what the minimum is for the period. So I think that you've taken that and proposed them up to that effect. So, any comments on that? nodding on your names up, but that's
Sorry,
right. Okay. So thank you for going through those rather detailed points, which now brings me on to the next question that I had, which was question 2.3, which was to be consistent with the London plan. Does policy H1 and all the region justification need to be modified to include reference to the London plan target? It's agreed is 47,000. Two elements of it expressed in the London plan, Newham and the London legacy corporation area. So that's that. It relates to a period 2019 to 29. And then I bring this forward, which I think is HBF said didn't disagree with about what the backlog or the residual is or whatever it is. So anyway, the way that you have proposed a modification to do what to refer to the target. So I'm going through some questions about that. So the first thing is about the PPG. It talks about SDSs, which the plan is, and it talks about them taking, basically setting targets for individual component parts of the SDS area, and then it goes on to say when that has been done, should not seek to revisit the local housing need figure when preparing new strategic policies. Again, you're saying take the SDS figure. Obviously, H1 Part A states boroughs must include targets in 4.1 in their development plan documents. So that's pretty clear. It doesn't say how or where in the development plan document it should be set. But what? I mean, we've got a modification, so we'll jump to that soon. But I mean, does it necessarily mean that the London Plan H1 target should be repeated, expressed as a residual requirement? Or, I mean, there's not really an answer. It says what it says, but I mean, do you want to say anything about that?
I think what that's a written statement on the ground is the GLA's position of the most sensible way to address that requirement.
I won't dwell on that. People can come back on any of these. I'm going to ask these questions anyway. So the way that it would be expressed in your modification would be to refer to it explicitly from 2027 to 2029. That's NPPF looking ahead 15 years from adoption. So the requirement, so if you're setting a target for the period you think, well, that would be it, and it would be equal for those 2 years. And would it say anything about the backlog or what had been completed up to that point, and acknowledgement that there had been a under provision?
So we proposed some text to the justification for the policy to address that point. So yeah, it's our responsibility to acknowledge and right. So there has been structural form against that.
The proposed mod doesn't quantify it, does it?
No, it doesn't. I think the reason that we didn't want to do that is because we thought it might create some confusion with policy and practice, because effectively with us starting the target from post the adoption of the plan, you would effectively get 2 years, where at the moment we don't necessarily have an understanding of what completion over those 2 years would be. So attributing a specific figure to it felt like it might add confusion to understanding the policy. It's not something that we're 100% opposed to, it's just difficult for us to find a way to do it clearly.
Well, it could be a factual statement between 2019 and 2024 or 25, whichever. So many completions were done. I mean, that would be an acknowledgement, it'd be explicit, everyone would know, so I'll put a note down. And then I'm going to come back to what I kind of alluded to earlier about this sort of limbo we might have if there's nothing said about a requirement apart from after 2027. But if you want to
just on that last point, I think we would welcome a clarification of the text on those lines that this is how the London plan target is being treated. The rest master plan as this statement of what is left to be delivered at this point in time. To a certain extent, it's academic because when the new London plan is published, certainly when it's adopted, to a certain extent, override the local plan. But I think it's important we don't lose sight of the requirements in the London plan.
Okay, well, you've noted, you've described something slightly different to what I did. I wasn't talking about, I was just talking about factual statement about what has been completed against the target.
Yeah, no, okay, sorry.
Yeah. Without any necessary implication about when that should be.
I agree. Just a factual statement about what has been completed.
Because
I think it's useful then, though, if you're in a planning appeal situation and an inspector's looking at delivery and mindful that there is this London plan target, which should really have delivered by 2028.
So, the step requirement would be for 2027. I mean, it wouldn't make any difference if it was from 2024 or 2025. From the point where completions you've got data to, what is that 2025 or?
Yeah, the most recent financial year, so 24-25 is the latest figures.
So this table modified could set a requirement from 2025 for London plan target.
It can do, yes. I think our position that we agreed later in statement around we felt that it was preferable to start the target from the period post.
5-year blocks that ending at
exactly. I mean, I think it's it's fair to say that our deliveries across the next 2 years is a lower projection than what we think we'll deliver from 27, 28 to 31, 32. So we want to ideally retain that target for those first years of the housing target period that we proposed. And we think the data suggests that we can do so. Our preference, and I think GLA's preference, is to keep the target start period in 27, 28, so we can continue to, say we're justified in keeping the plan target for those years.
But when's the plan's adopted before 2027, how would you interpret where you are in that little, I mean, it may be only a few months, but there's a bit of a limbo, isn't there?
So I think it's a fair point that we didn't get a huge amount of discussion,
No,
to be honest.
it's quite
we're actually
academic.
focused on, and I think that's it. So I think from my point of view, the London plan sets housing targets. Newham's been monitoring their projections against an annualized interpretation of that target. What we want to see for plans that up until 2029. Fundamentally, there's a separate discussion about the 5-year housing land supply and the buffer, and that links into Claire's point. But I think for the purposes of pragmatism, the plan needs to be clear that up to 28, 29 is relying on the London plan to set the target. It is the annualized version because that's how things have been monitored in the past. That's supported by the factual statement of the backlog, and I think that's workable.
So it'd be a fairly straightforward factual statement that the London plan target for the London plan target 2019 was 2029 was X. So we were completing that period. That target applies from that period onward through to 2029 still. So it's just okay. So the way that the next 2 5-year blocks are worked out is you've got a total capacity for 2027 to 22. Yeah. You take off the requirements from 27 to 29. That leaves you whatever. And then you split that up into the other 2 blocks. Based on capacity.
Yeah, it is a little bit confusing to put it out broad on this paper, but the way we sort of approach it is we consider that there's more uncertainty attached to those high range figures in the short term that are progressing or they are progressing planning applications that are, for instance, close to being determined, or they are already implemented sites that are requiring perhaps so what we've looked to do is we've looked to assume the high range periods in total, and the short term is divided into two time periods, which we have told. So 27, 28, 28, 29 would be aligned with the plan target, and then 29, 30, 31, 32, based on high range delivery, albeit that period would account for a 20% contingency, depending on historic delivery against the sense.
So it'd be capacity.
Yes.
Plus you've added 20% on.
Yeah. So that would be effectively the 20% of the range of short term would be applied to those last 3 years. It is a little bit confusing. But that's how we would propose to address it for us to be able to keep the long target over the first 2 years. And then for the medium and long term, because the higher range figures for those sites are more dependent on the infrastructure delivery, which as yet is concerned, base those figures on the low range capacities and those are annualised over the 5-year block. So however much we're delivering across that period, we would annualise year on year for those periods in the second target.
So the purpose of all that is to reflect the London Plan target and to deliver it as quickly as you can against it.
Yeah.
But being realistic.
Yes, and account for the market.
Okay. Right, so any comments from others on that? So the proposed modification would acknowledge the target, acknowledge the figure, under delivery, and quantify it, and we would set out those that described and come back to this at some later point in the examination when we thought about the policies and the site capacities and buildings and sort of things. But I understand the way it's constructed and the way the qualification is and the rationale for it. Okay, so anything else from anyone on? Yeah, that was useful.
Great if we could find out what those numbers were, if possible.
Yes, no, we will do. And so at the point in time when we submitted the matters paper, we had quite a biased trajectory with the GLA and statement on the ground. So that is included in our council response to the next set of matters paper. So 5, I believe it is, that hasn't been this.
Excellent. What's that read across it?
Yeah, I know. There's a lot of figures, and as I said this morning, I will do an action point note, and I will try and clarify what I think what to do without putting the numbers in, filling the gaps at some point. So, to a point where, but we will come back to this probably at a later session. It's probably not on the agenda. We'll come back to housing land supply in January. But whether we need to come back and look at exactly the way the requirement is expressed, all that, I think I'll review it because it may depend on how much things shift around again in terms of the capacity. The implication may then be for the actual detail of these things. So, anything else from anyone on that? Housing? No. Okay. Good. Well, thank you for that. It is now 3:10. So we'll have a break. I think we've dealt with, unless I've missed something, I think we've dealt with the housing plan period. So we're going to move on to the industrial and office floor space requirements after the break. Mr. Rapley's patiently sat through also housing. We'll get into that shortly. So, if anyone wishes to leave because they're not interested in industry and office floor space, feel free to do so. We have a break now until 3:30. Okay, right, so it is 3:30, so we will resume. And we're on to the last agenda item for today, which is the industrial office floor space requirements. So paragraph 3.1 and policy J1, the need for 335,000 square metres of industrial floor space and 90,000 square metres of office floor space over the plan period to 2038. So that was 2023 to 2038.
Yeah.
Those figures have been calculated.
It was 2023 was the last monitoring year.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. It started. Your calculation started from 2021, but then
Yes, updated to 23
Yeah,
using
okay.
the most recent.
thank you for that. Yeah. Right. Okay. So they are based on the Employment Land Review 2022, and hence that was the base day of 2021. So I suppose the first question about that. Oh, sorry. And then the industrial floor space target is based on past trend job delivery 2009 to 19.
Yeah.
So it was jobs, not floor space.
Yes.
It was calculated into floor space from jobs.
Yeah.
Why? Yeah, sorry. You anticipated why that way around.
Because London has, over the last 10 or so years, developed a chronic shortage of industrial land
Yeah.
and problematic viability in delivering GLA intensified formats. So when we did the Employment Land Review, we noticed that if we projected forward floor space, which
Yeah.
is what we might do elsewhere,
It would be very low.
it came up with a lower number than if we projected forward the jobs. And knowing that London's had a shortage of industrial land, even for people wanting to build and a problem finding space, viably building it, recognising that London-wide there's a chronic shortage, it seemed more positive to allow the jobs to continue to grow and to allow those jobs to continue to grow in a more reasonable floor space.
Yeah, rather than
Density.
businesses being constrained by unsuitable premises and whatever. Yeah.
So there's a big debate outside of London to the extent to which London's constrained its land supply in the past. But here certainly we've had a higher job delivery, so that's the route.
So it's a positive
On down.
approach to calculate
Yeah.
it. And it's based on 2009 to 19. This was done in 2020. Why 2019? 2009 to 19. So that's quite a long period, economic cycles and all that.
So we're reliant on the ONS to publish job data, which is always a few years behind. You don't have 22 job data, you'd have 19, 20 job data. Of course, if we're sitting down and writing reports in 22, of course 2020, 21, we just had COVID, nobody knew what was going on. So the general approach was to take the pre-COVID job delivery and the look pre-COVID, because of course in London nothing was delivered in COVID. The industry absolutely shut down. So there's a bit of caution to it in looking slightly backwards to just identify what's a reasonable period. And as you pointed out here, we went for quite a long-term period. So we know that over quite a prolonged period, Enfield's been delivering industrial jobs quite successfully. So it's
Newham as well.
Sorry. Yeah. Too many boroughs get mixed up. You have been delivering those industrial jobs. There's no indication in what you'd call the market signal data or the sentiment of the market that that job delivery would slow down. And if anything, of course, post-COVID, there was a rapid increase in demand, in industrial demand. So even when we were looking at this, even when we updated the numbers to bring them up to date, it still seemed a sensible period to look at, even accepting that it's slightly dated. I wouldn't like, and I'm very cautious about relying on data from 2020.
Yeah, understood. Yeah.
It's a real problem.
Just remind me, which is the document you're updating published recently?
There's an update to the numbers attached to the matter statement.
Yeah,
Yeah,
So
it's attached to the statement, isn't it?
There will be a payment to the matter.
Yeah. I was just looking at it in the ED list, it's not there.
Yeah. So this is a document as appended to matter 2, which we'll come on to. We've updated a bit in the supply when we go to matter 8. It doesn't affect the need.
Okay.
Supply really.
So understood on the industrial land, and that when we call industrial land, this is industrial and warehouse.
It's industrial and warehouse.
So B2, B8, and light industry.
And light industry. They're quite, in London boroughs, they're quite mixed.
Yeah.
So if you were outside of London, you could probably identify a separate big B8 number. If you were in the Midlands, etc. It doesn't really flow through to London. Most of the industrial estates are thoroughly mixed. So you'll have larger industrial next to smaller, and even the same estate will have units that are subdivided and occupied by small. So it's presented here as a big industrial number, and how the market chooses to respond to that in the format that they come forward with is sort of the market. We have only limited land supply, so it's a case that I can sit here and say, what I really want is a fantastic day site sitting there. I do outside here and I can't hear. I'm dealing with what I've got. But it's quite a mixed structure. We want to keep it that way because we want a range of employment opportunities across the industrial board and to support our creatives at the same time as making sure Amazon has somewhere to park his vans at night.
Yeah. Okay, no, thank you. Yeah, understood. So that's the industrial warehouse industry. Now the office floor space target, that's based on the economic forecast.
Yes.
The reason for that being that approach is
it's one of the approaches prescribed in the PPG.
Yeah.
Projecting forward plus floor space for offices, especially in London, is very unreliable because of limited development rights.
Okay.
So PDL stripped out occupied space as it did vacant space. So what you often find is that you've been losing floor space but gaining jobs because you've been losing stuff by PDR.
Yeah.
So here, Experian gives a positive number. It doesn't give a huge positive number. But for Newham as a whole, it seemed a reasonable number. Slight added dimension to that for LLDC and the rollout docs sites, they have a floor space that doesn't respond. They have a floor space that responds to GLA policy aspirations. So the GLA have a very large pipeline of consented office schemes within Stratford and within the Albert Docks, which extends to about 650,000 square metres, because the GLA's aspiration is to grow a new Canary Wharf almost at Stratford. There's no need analysis that you can do to arrive at that number. It's whole placemaking, agenda changing. So the number for the borough is an Experian number, it's a minimum number we will meet. And then we know that we've got a very large pipeline supply on top of that, which is permitted.
Yeah, okay.
And we're not taking that away. There's no solution to
okay.
take it away. But it means that we have a large supply in excess of any borough need.
Yeah, okay. So to some extent, the need figure is kind of academic because the policy approach is to deliver more than that for other reasons, not to meet needs.
Yes, it's the London plan to create a new Stratford, build up those big investments, and of course Royal Albert, ABP, as it's called, was a big international investment into the UK. It was never a scheme. It's like one of those things added on top.
Yeah, so
we all want to see it work. We all want to see it happen. It does generate a very large supply.
okay. So we've already mentioned the update to rolling forward to 2042. Just to remind me what that took account of in terms of what going back to 2022 being based on the up to 2010, that looked at market. Did a reality check on that?
Yes.
Yeah.
So when we rolled it forward, the forecast didn't quite reach 2042. I think it ended a year or two earlier.
Yeah, I think it's 2041.
So we rolled forwards the forecast to give us an updated office number. For industrial, we just projected forwards those additional 3 years. So there was no suggestion that we'd have to go back and revisit the direction of travel for our industrial demand. It's always positive. And just to give you a little so it's loosely relevant to housing. But when the London plan was prepared, for its industrial, it was advanced on a scenario whereby in the first 5 years, which was up to 2020, it would lose 50 hectares of industrial land across London. When the GLA updated their strategic evidence in 23, they found that London had lost 350 hectares. So the order of and the speed of industrial land release on the back of the plan was far in excess of the GLA ever expected. So London-wide, the vacancy rates, if you read some of the old evidence, it was about surplus vacancy in industrial and things like that. But if you go and to find surplus vacancy now, it's evaporated and gone into housing. So we're now running a vacancy of about 4% in the borough, whereas you would like the old rule of thumb is about 7.5 is what you'd like. So we've lost a lot of occupied space. Our vacancy rates are under pressure. When you speak to the industrial agents, they want more, not less.
Yes, I suppose, if anything then, the assessment of the 335,000 over the period, you could say that subsequent events demonstrate that's on the low side of everything, rather than.
Yeah, if we look for what COVID did to the industrial market in the last few years, yeah, it will give us a very positive number nationally. So yeah, we wouldn't have, because of the COVID years being so disrupted in terms of data, I couldn't go lay my hand on data to project forwards, but any market analysis can take this day strong positive. And the numbers we've got at the moment, we can only just about hit on the supply side reliant upon quite significant intensification within that rate.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Yeah, we don't have an infinite pot just to go out and say, well, we'll take our needs from other people. We'll be even more cautious. It wouldn't pragmatically get us anywhere for the purpose of in this plan.
Okay, thank you. So the modification would be J1 refer to 418,000 square metres industrial floor space on a period of 2022.
Yeah. Should
that actually be clearer about what the period is? Because we talked about when period. I mean, what is it? It's 2020.
Strictly, it's the residual from the last monitoring data, say 2023. So everything before that's taken into account.
So it would say 480,000 square metres industrial floor space between 2023 and 2042.
Yes, that number is strictly. I think. But it's been updated on the supply side between 21 to 23. So the demand number was calculated from 2021, but that number, that 417, includes planning permissions that were updated.
Yeah.
When we updated to bring it into line with the 2023 monitoring data.
Okay, I think what I'll do, I think it should specify a date, so it's clear.
Yeah.
I will do an action point, and you can tell me the most accurate or relevant.
It works either way. It's correct from 2021 because it knows about what's been delivered since 2021.
It would be a residual requirement. I mean, if there had been a lot of floor space delivered, the residual requirement would come down if you take it.
So the 418 is the snapshot as of it took into account planning permissions that were inside the 2023 monitoring.
And completions up to that.
And you should have the completions as well.
Okay, well, let's leave it for that. I'll leave you to work out the exact. I think as a matter of principle, it's helpful for the policy to express it over a clear time period to avoid any ambiguity. In the future, if it becomes important, it may not become a particularly important decision making we could do. And then the office one was again prorated forward based on experience. I mean, they've looked to 2021 anyway. I think just put
I think we had to roll. I think it ended in 2039.
Okay.
So we looked at the trend periods through it, and we simply rolled it forwards. The job numbers in the latter end of the plan period and experience were slightly higher than the beginning of the plan period. So when we added on the additional 3 years, we took slightly higher than the average, but that was simply what the data suggested to do.
But again, there is a time period over which that relates. Yeah, that could be specified. Okay, thank you. So we talked about that strategic policy would be clear in its own right. The evidence is as it describes. It would be a figure for that period that's defined, and if that becomes relevant for decision making, it would be clear. If people want to work out what's happened or not happened. And we'll talk about how it could be met through policies in the plan. Under okay, thank you. Right. But what it does is just reinforce the need for industrial intensification. Right, okay, thank you for that. That's all clear. I haven't got any more questions. Anything else you want to say on this? No? No? No. It's very straightforward. It's a pretty discreet issue.
Yeah, we just want to emphasize that the target is based on justified and up-to-date target requirement, and the change in the updated target didn't alter our policy position.
No.
I think our policy is effective in line with the plan.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Right, so that brings us to the end of the agenda for today. Anything anybody wishes to say or ask? There's any housekeeping matters. We are back tomorrow for matter 3. It just matter 4. We start matter 4, don't we? On N17, where we touched on this morning to pick up on that. So just to go back to what I was saying earlier on that as we go through the allocations in terms of the viability. I think is it reasonably clear what I'm getting at in terms of what that evidence shows us, but that may be qualified by more site-specific planning permission, and I think that's what, when you did the pro formas, you alluded to that where there is a planning permission, sometimes that may provide more nuanced or more up-to-date or more refined information about capacity, but also about viability. So we can talk about those as we go through. And I think just looking at that table, it's just being clear about that particular bit of work that Mr. Lee did suggest for those particular sites. Okay.
So it's to more or less update the performer, or to
no, I think we need to update the performer. It's just, I will note down that based on that table, ED12, site is on road, whatever, and it shows that the residual land value is red minus whatever.
Brilliant.
Yeah. So just that, really, just so I can look at that. I mean, it's fairly clear from the tables.
Yeah.
There may be something else we need to say, but actually, yes, that's what that says. But since then, we've got the commission, and that was viability tested. And okay. Right. So thank you all for your contributions today. One day done, successfully completed. We'll be back tomorrow morning, 9:30. Thank you.
Thank you.